So now we have a very intriguing topic, locating contemporary Catholicism in relation to Apostolicae Curae, what it tells Catholics about themselves. And we have a celebrated scholar, Professor Thomas O'Laughlin, who is Professor of Historical Theology at Nottingham University, with a rich background experience of teaching, University College in Dublin, University of Wales, Yale University, Bangor University, Tantur Institute, and it's a long, long list, too long to quote them all. His focus of research and interest is the theology of the early medieval period, an area in which he has also widely published and edited books and essays in another long list of specialized theological review. He is chief editor of the Bripple series Studia Traditionis Theologiae and the Library of Christian Sources. He has been president of the Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain and member of the Royal Irish Academy. Professor Laughlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's delightful to be here, and this is a topic that is very dear to my heart, and it's great to make the acquaintance of the Centro. So, I'd like to begin with two contrasting anecdotes. They both relate to the visit to your cathedral by Pope Benedict XVI on the 17th of September 2010. A couple of days before that, I think it took place on a Friday afternoon, I was sharing a drink with colleagues in Nottingham after our Wednesday seminar, and the talk turned to the papal visit, and we reflected on how this was such a great advance from some of the bitter exchanges that had taken place in the previous several hundred years. A colleague then drew us all up short by pointing out that this lacked Christian integrity, because from this colleague's point of view, Dr. Williams should have turned to the Pope and said, "Am I a brother bishop, or am I a confused layman running an organisation on Christian principles?" Now, it's a sharp reality. We want our worship and our liturgy to be real, and openness and honesty is a characteristic that we must have. Simple honesty. I was shocked by that, and it has remained with me for the last 11 years as an issue that I feel we have to bring always to the front of our mind if we try to do anything in the world of not ecumenism, but creating the relationships within the Church as the community of the baptized. 2 days later, I didn't see it myself, but I believe that the BBC announced when the Pope was entering your cathedral, the announcer said in that pompous voice that announcers have when they say, "And now he is moving up the aisle," that he was wearing a stole that had once been owned by Pope Leo XIII. I got a phone call from a friend, a Roman Catholic presbyter, who said, "Shows you, he's wearing Leo XIII's stole. He's reasserting Apostolicae Curae. It's all a fraud." So there is a dangerous way that we use symbols in a very negative way. But if you write on intercommunion, and when I published this, I wasn't ready for the fact your inbox, the moment you write on intercommunion, you get ready for a full inbox. Most of it is cracked. But the number of emails I got which pointed me to a footnote in the 1998 document Ad Tuendum Fidem, which pointed at it's infallible. So Apostolicae Curae is not just something between the churches, it's something that is touching something very deep within the problematic self-perception of the Roman communion. And that was brought home to me only a couple of months ago, when I heard of an Anglican presbyter who had decided to join the Roman Catholic Church, and I met him subsequently and said, "Oh, well, I believe you've become a Roman Catholic." Yes, he said, it was rather embarrassing when at my reception, the local parish priest gave a homily saying that he hoped I was looking forward to making my first communion. Now, this priest was considerably older than I am, and I am no young chicken. What worried me about that sermon is that it thinks of theology, and it thinks more importantly of the mysteries of faith in terms of a zero-sum game. Now, the very fact that we Catholics can so easily fall into that zero-sum game approach suggests that examining Apostolicae Curae may be a mirror that will help us clarify where we are. And so, in what I'm going to say in this talk, I'm mainly addressing my own communion and saying it points out problems that we have, and that if we can face the problems of Apostolicae Curae, there are several benefits. Let's not start with theology. Let's start with history and the concept of history that is being used in the late 19th century. For instance, it was a common statement that there could be an encyclopedia of all known facts. The Cambridge Modern History, which began at this time, saw that you could write down all that was to be known historically. There could be a complete and definitive history. And well into the 20th century, you will find history books that will claim this is the definitive account. Theology, at that time, also saw itself primarily as a deductive discipline. All that was needed to be known was known, and this became an explicit epistemology in Roman Catholic theology, and Leo is a perfect example of this. His notion of tradition, Tavard has tried to tease that out over the years, is that the tradition is not only perfect, but it is perfectly known. This is the Catholic equivalent of the evangelical notion of the all-sufficiency of Scripture. If you need to know it, it's there, and if it's there, you need to know it. So we've actually got a very strange notion that's underlying our theology, which we would rarely explicitly own, and yet it's living within our body like some sort of underlying virus as we all look out from behind our masks. The most explicit form that takes is the notion of infallibility. Why do we not have the idea that the Pope's teaching is indefectible or that it is always authentic? We give it this logical quality of infallibility because the assumption is that we have all the premises. If you know everything, then you only need to know that the program is working perfectly, and then anything that the program chucks out will itself be perfect. Infallibility is primarily a logical notion relying on an epistemology. And we forget that Apostolicae Curae lives within that epistemological world. The most important aspect of that is that empiricism has no place. And yet within Catholic theology today, empiricism has now been given a formal place. We've referred to the liturgy on several occasions. Joris has referred to it as the this great sea from which we draw. But we forget that implicit in the reform of Holy Week in 1956 is the assumption that by going back into the past, one can produce a more perfect liturgy. Now, the Apostolic Constitution that promulgates Ordo Hebdomadae Sanctae actually tries to pretend that there could be nothing wrong with the liturgy in 1950, therefore it couldn't be any better in 1955. Well, why do it? It becomes explicit in a more important document from 1964, which Catholics tend to refer to not by its Latin title Sancta Mater Ecclesiae, but the 1964 instruction, which formally takes on board the notion that there is actually a role for empiricism in the study of the New Testament. But of course that forgets that the four canonical Gospels, perfectly known, are considered to be the primary source of canon law. So we have the 1964 instruction, which interestingly transformed the teaching of Scripture, but didn't transform the teaching of the history of doctrine. And then, to pick up on what was said earlier, we have the very interesting statement from Pope Benedict XVI on the anaphora of Adai and Mari. Again, the document, I noticed in your paper you said it contains no explicit institution. It contains no institution narrative. It may have some late medieval and 16th century contaminations. It doesn't contain. That's the problem. It doesn't contain. But that is actually based on historical work done in France in the late 1960s and published in the early 1970s, which makes the very obvious point, looking at the early documents, that the whole notion of an institution narrative is, of course, a secondary Eucharistic development that may actually reflect a lack of understanding of the Eucharist in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and the need to historicize in the context of a blessing prayer that no longer is to an open meal. So we have actually historical investigation allowing a complete change in the matter and form of a sacrament that completely undermines a canonical edifice. And yet, curiously, when one reads the document, there is an invention to try and pretend that it's actually there, but in an inchoate way. Whenever the word inchoate is used in theology, it usually means I don't like facing historical facts. Not only is there a problem with the notion of empiricism in theology, but the empiricism of the historian is always a negative empiricism. And that is something else that couldn't be taken on board in 1896. Popper had not yet been born. The historian not only proceeds empirically rather than deductively, but produces an observation that is open to falsification. It is not a positive statement. Yet all the statements within Apostolicae Curae presuppose that history produces positive statements. In fact, it produces sententiae. History, within its notion of sacramentality, was a legal notion of precedent or the lack of precedent. It didn't occur in a past time, it occurred in merely an earlier moment of the clock, because historians of canon law point out that canon law, even when it refers to its own history, exists in the hodie of law. They investigated the mid-16th century as if it happened in a diocesan synod somewhere just outside Rome in 1895. And it's that flaw that underpins Francis Clarke's book. And I notice that it's his notes on Apostolicae Curae that's invariably used by English bishops when they refer to it. He thinks that history is just looking at the day before yesterday, which is merely today, but with a different calendar date. He doesn't allow for real historical change. Now again, this is something that Tavard noted when he, in his very famous 1996 paper. Leo preferred to use older decisions than to make a fresh inquiry. And wherever you could repeat an older decision, the hodie, you were in a stronger position than by actually looking at the material afresh. Do you see how completely different that is to our culture, where historical investigation is seen as a primary route at getting at the facts of the past, precisely because it is done now afresh? Apostolicae Curae is not a historical document of a historian. It is merely the repetition of many todays, so that this day can never contradict that day. So I heard recently of a Dominican theologian who said, well, if they were invalid in 1896, they must be invalid now. But that presupposes that we can never grow in knowledge. And that is the difference between the empiricism of history and the use of history in Apostolicae Curae. We tend to think, and again I'm speaking as a Roman Catholic, we tend to think of John Henry Newman as the one who's this great new idea of development. But John Henry Newman is not actually a modern historian. He is the tail end of a model of history that began, some would say, with Luke, and certainly with Eusebius. The notion that history contains in itself everything, and then merely we extract parts of the development out of it. John Henry Newman assumes it's all there at the start, and then we can find it today. But the historian assumes that every historical moment is incomplete, and therefore my take will be better than the previous take, but tomorrow's take will be better than mine. So the first benefit I see is that if we can face up to the reality of the defects of Apostolicae Curae, we get ourselves out of a self-serving logic of repetition. It stops us, Roman Catholics, confusing ourselves, where we face a reality with one epistemology, and yet we use documents with a different epistemology. We often use the phrase from Aquinas of truth as adequatio rei intellectus. In the 19th century, they emphasized the aequatio. In the 20th century and today, we emphasize the adequatio. It's this moving towards. For us, history is partial. That's an epistemological premise. And time is a blind sieve. We've lost as much as we've kept. And that's an ontological premise. Historical investigation doesn't confront the real, but it confronts the extant traces of the real. It doesn't find answers as in a court, but uncovers evidence and scraps of evidence, themselves always partial. The lack of knowledge of what we can say Jesus said would have, to use an American expression, blown Leo's mind. Our aim is to construct a world of human beings whose understanding is as partial as our own. I cannot get into the mind of Reginald Pole, Thomas Cranmer, Leo X, Martin Luther, or for that matter, Luke, Paul, or Jesus. And the question that we will pose is always different from the world that has left these traces. So the questions of the 16th century world or the 1896 world and the world in 2022, these are different question frames. And so we will never have enough evidence from an earlier period to answer the precise and more precise questions of a later period. Looking back to something like the text of the apostolic tradition to try and find out were women ordained as deacons, as I saw was happening a few years ago in a debate on women in the diaconate, is just as silly as asking their views on climate change. You can't do it. So the second benefit is it may force us to realize that we can't look back to the past and start thinking in the past we find a pattern for the future. That is the fundamental assumption of Newman's method. It's the fundamental assumption running under an awful lot of official documents. And yet we can't. We know we can't do it. Likewise, and here's where history meets linguistics, we can't assume there's a perfect theological language. And Leo is one of the last writers whose Latin poetry is in the Oxford collection of Latin poetry. It begins with the pre-Virgilian poets and it ends with Leo XIII. And the Latin gives us this great illusion of continuity. But the Latin of Jerome, the Latin of 1550, the Latin of 1896, hide different worlds under similar syntax and a similar lexicon. I'm old enough to have spent money buying Kittel and Friedrich's Theologische Wörterbuch. You go into any second-hand bookstore in Europe today and you can pick it up for a couple of pounds or a couple of euros. They're glad to shift that much off their shelf. It's not because people have stopped using Kittel. It's because our understanding, we know that Kittel's work from the 1930s is now out of date. Kittel, in the introduction, said, language changes. I must know what a word meant then, and then. And so does understanding, so we don't read Kittel. Language is, on the one hand, our connection to the past, but it's also that which marks the boundary between that world and our world. And yet many Roman Catholic theologians, despite such things as the 1964 instruction, do not feel comfortable with that notion and would much prefer an idea that history is a big narrative ending in our now. I was listening to an English bishop a couple of months ago giving a talk on Zoom, and he said to me, he said at the end of it, "Critical study leaves me cold. I much prefer to read St. Augustine and how he sings with St. John rather than the critical investigations of the critics." Well, if you happen to like that, that's fine. Your aesthetic taste is your aesthetic taste. But we have to get out of that false world that we can colonize either the New Testament or St. Augustine, or indeed Leo XIII. And that I see as the second benefit. The third benefit is that history in theory exists within a larger paradigm about what theology is about. Oxford has just produced the 4th edition of the Dictionary of the Christian Church. And I couldn't resist when I was coming here, to look up the word Anglicanism in the first edition and in the current edition. In the first edition, Anglicans here will be pleased to know the Church of England began in 314 when there were several British bishops at the Synod of Arles. The 4th edition, published about 2 weeks ago, says that the Anglican Church traces its roots to the 1530s. When I hear people saying this is the 406, or I can't remember the number, successor of St. Peter in Rome, please get real. We know that until the 3rd century there were many leaders in this city calling themselves Pope. There were several calling themselves Bishop, all simultaneously for different communities. The idea that you could have a nice, clean running order is an invention of Eusebius, because Eusebius must have perfect history. Just as there's a perfect gospel, buy a copy of Nestle Aland and look at Eusebius's work in the margins. You must have a perfect history. What once was is not a guarantee of what is or of what will be. The historical turn is one that is completely full of only one thing: incompleteness. Sorores in Spe talks about participating in a mystery. I'd like to change that to a more historian's word and say the importance is to live creatively within a myth. And apostolic succession, which is underlying the whole debate, of which Apostolicae Curae is just one moment, is the notion that his apostolic succession is a historical fact. Jesus founded the church and ordained the apostles as bishops, and on and on. Or, as they would have said then, Christ founded the church. Did Christ found a church? Would any New Testament scholar today support that idea? He couldn't. There was already the Church of Israel. Was he legislating for 2022? He thought the world was coming to an end. We think of Jesus as the beginning of something. He saw himself, insofar as we can reconstruct him, insofar as the tail end of the Kahal, the church. Did he ordain? Well, it's good to know that he knew the idea of ordo. The first serious descriptions of ordo are more interested in the fact that clergy are entitled to wear the vesta talaris, are entitled to use the imperial postal service, and are entitled to wear purple on certain occasions than they are in whether they have apostolic succession. So we have to treat apostolic succession as one of these myths that we have used historically, and as a myth it can be both constricting and it can be creative. It's used in a restrictive way in Apostolicae Curae and in the people who sent me all those emails. But it can also be, a myth can also open up new possibilities. It can open up the possibility that we see ourselves not just doing our thing now, but as part of this great family that is doing the thing that has its roots in the Church of Israel and will only come to completion in the eschatological banquet. The one thing you cannot do with a myth without falsifying it is to confuse it with history. The moment you do that, you not only destroy the integrity of history, you destroy the creative authority of myth. So perhaps the greatest benefit is that it will allow us to face our myths. And then the prize. Once you face your myth as myth, you live within your myth, live within our myth, as a life-giving mystery, not as a set of bits, pieces, and material facts. Thank you for your... I'm aware that George Tavard said somewhere that no one should write more than 10 pages on Apostolicae Curae unless they say something new. I am aware that I haven't said anything new, but thank you for your patience.
Just thank you so much for such a stimulating reflection, going really in depth to the document and giving us many insights to reflect upon historical, theological, epistemological, linguistic, and also thank you for doing it in such a vivid way. Thank you so much. Now let's treasure these 15 minutes again to ask questions to Professor Laughlin or remarks, and again everyone is welcome to contribute to this study day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that scintillating presentation. I couldn't help think, as I was hearing you speak, of a philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who in many instances speaks about the same reality that you're talking about in terms of language. When I speak a sentence, I have no longer control over that sentence. So I cannot even recover what is the content of that sentence absolutely. And so he would talk about, it was like putting my foot in a river. The water that passed over it is gone.
Pantarai.
That's right. So I think this observation is really important for epistemological and linguistic approach to a document like Apostolicae Curae, Sorores in Spe, and the life that we live within the Church. I don't know how much you know of Paul Ricoeur, but I think he is a big help for us today in terms of doing theological reflection. I know when I do a course on methodology, I use that work on interpreting conflict, the conflict of interpretation, because students today can't deal with this. They are suffocated by information, and they don't have the tools, the keys for even dealing with what they are reading, what they're hearing, what they're thinking themselves. Can you maybe say something about that?
Well, yes, you can probably see my own, you can see that Paul Ricoeur is operating in part of what I'm saying, and indeed Paul Ricard reacted and built on one of the people who is central to this, and that is the work of Rudolf Bultmann. Because people forget that people like Bultmann, their own work on, let's say, the synoptic tradition is not worth reading today. It's just not worth reading. It's out of date. But their insight that the reality of the documents does not die with the actual format of the document is the crucial reality of the presence of the Christ in the Church for Bultmann. Bultmann actually and this will be true of Ricard as well, because there is actually I can't remember where it is. There's actually quite a brilliant essay by Ricard on how he builds upon Bultmann. But if you actually look at something that Bultmann says about myth, you realize that for Bultmann, the text provides the myth in much the same way that the Eucharist provides the locus of the Blessed Sacrament for Catholics. They both have the myth is the moment of sacramental encounter with the reality beyond, and I think the same is true for Ricard. The curious thing is that I keep my copy of Kittel now in the garage. It's perfectly dry, but it means that I have to actually go out in the rain, and I had to go out to get it just to work out the date that the first volume appeared. It was 1933, and it continued to 1973. And I saw the price I paid for it. And the funny thing is, I just opened the volume Alpha, and you realize that even though it's not worth reading, it really isn't worth reading, it's not worth keeping. But they're so clear that it's only by encountering that which is the myth, and that has a clarity in their writing, which I think is so. If you do buy it, ignore what it says, but look at its method.
Thank you very much. Maybe our librarians should relocate our Kittels. Let's keep it in mind, please. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. I wondered if I can ask you a question about apostolic succession and apostolicity. Our document, from memory, doesn't use the phrase apostolic succession, and I think the reason for that is that apostolic succession tends to rely on rather brittle concepts such as validity and status and so on and so forth. Whereas it strikes me that the modern discourse around apostolicity, both from a theological and an historical perspective, is a richer mise en scène. I wonder if you can say a bit about that as an historian.
Well, it's the notion of apostolicity, apostolic succession links back this word in the creeds, one Holy Catholic Apostolic, is very much a word, of course, that comes into prominence in the 3rd and early 4th centuries. And it actually it's actually a code word, like the word orthodox when used by Eastern Christians today. Orthodox should actually be a quality of theology, but actually it's a quality of which team you belong to. And the group that can use the word apostolic enters theology as a way of saying we're the right group. We are not this group, we are not that group, and particularly we are not the groups that we are labeling as Gnostic. It's not an accident that Eusebius presents his entire history as a history of the Apostolic Church. Well, think about it. And this is, why do we use the word apostolic? Apostoloi were people between churches. They certainly belong to the second generation. They are emissaries. They are one group in a whole army of links that built up the early churches. If there were a group, insofar as we can construct it from documents later again, the canonical Gospels, there is a group called the 12. But the historians who invented the concept of apostolicity didn't have the concept of the 12 because they already had a church of bishops. So bishops became equivalent to apostles. And of course, you can always go back to that famous mistranslation, and his episcopatus let another take. But of course, that's a piece of pure circular reasoning. One of the questions I have with the word apostolic is that it makes great sense in the 4th century for a group saying, we're the nice people. It's one of these irregular verbs. We are apostolic, they are Gnostic. But it shows how little they actually understood about the period they thought was apostolic. And there's a very interesting way of proving that. Think of Junia, first among the apostles. By the 4th century, the texts are already corrupting, because, of course, the texts are themselves living texts, and they're already to invent this new male name that never existed, Unias. So already you can see there the misinterpretation of the past gives a concept in the present which then restructures the past. So it can be a term that is deeply resonant to all churches that like reading their history. But what if you're talking to a group of Christians who don't read their history and to whom the idea of loving study of the Nicene Creed is not seen as some life-giving experience? Then maybe what we really need is another concept that captures the same idea, which would be something like loyalty to the mission of Jesus.
Archbishop Henn, please.
Jan Ernest from the Anglican Centre. Thank you very much for your most pertinent words this morning. And a question raises to my mind. What would change if Anglican orders were recognized today?
Well, on the ground, I don't think anything would change at all. But I think within the Roman Catholic Church, if we actually said, look, we actually got it wrong. Hey, whoops, we made a mistake. Let's put that down to experience. I think that would be very good for us. You'd have to get up on Sunday morning and celebrate the Eucharist and get your sermon ready. I'd have to do the same. So nothing. Some of your people might come on holiday where I am. That would be handy for them, and vice versa. But my God, wouldn't it be very nice if we could actually say, when we've actually done it partly. We've reformed the liturgy. We have recognized Adi and Mari. We have actually embraced New Testament criticism. We have actually embraced critical historical method all over the place. We just haven't brought it home to meet Mama yet. And that's what I think that would be so good for Catholicism. And I can think of lots of other churches, and it's not my job there's lots of other hugga-mugga bits in other churches where they could bring home a real historical method and introduce it to Mama and say, here, this is what it is. Because they pretend. I know evangelicals that, want to pretend that it all happened in a perfect way, just as I know Catholics who think that doctrine exists perfectly. So we could all learn from one another. But I think on Sunday, I think the best thing would be that we could look one another in the eye and actually, to use Archbishop Tutu's words, if we can face truth, we can be reconciled. And I think at the moment, a lot of Catholics, I sometimes take my glasses off because I then don't have to look at problems. So I think we as Catholics need to face our demons. That introduction that was written by someone for Pope Benedict on Adai and Mari is just a complete piece of obfuscation. It's pretend, it's all really there, but it's not. Yeah, this is the world of the pantomime, There's a lovely story about how did they justify new Eucharistic. It was a statement of fact in 1964. There could not be another Eucharistic prayer because the Roman Church's Eucharistic prayer was perfect. Do you know the justification that was used for the largest change in Eucharistic practice in the Latin Church in 1600 years was the fact that the Pope had introduced Eiusdem Virginis Sponsi. If a Pope could change one word, then we could have 4 new Eucharistic prayers. Now that's childishness. That is really childishness. There is a case in the Roman Eucharistic Prayer 1, which disappeared in the translations of the late 60s and re-emerged in the translation of 2011. Sometime in the 8th century, a rubric slipped into the text. Some careless monk forgot to put vel into red. So we produced 1,000 years of people explaining a sentence that broke every rule of not only Latin grammar, but Indo-European grammar, of how you could have singular verbs with plural subjects and plural subjects with singular verbs, on the basis that it was a mystical interpretation. No, it was a scribal blunder that paleographers knew about. And then they couldn't change the Latin, so they left it up to the translators. And then they got worried the translators weren't doing their job. So we put it in, and now people don't understand it again. Now that's a level of internal incomprehension that we need to face. And Apostolicae Curae is a classic example of breaking all these rules of understanding and interpretation.
Professor
Jam
Lovely.
tempus elapsum.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You are really pushing us to an intellectual metanoia, so your insights will really accompany us throughout the day. I'm glad to welcome our last speaker for this morning, and we had a very rich morning, so we have an enriching speaker to conclude the morning. He's Professor William Henn, Professor Emeritus at the Pontifical Gregorian University, Consultant to the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, but involved in many other pontifical commissions and institutions. He's vice moderator of the Faith and Order Commission, and he's been involved and still is involved in many bilateral dialogues of the Catholic Church with the Lutherans, the Reformed, the Mennonites, the Pentecostals, the Baptists, and of course, he's not only a member of these dialogues, but it is more appropriately to say that he's the soul of this group, really, and drafter. It's true, Professor Henn, I can tell by experience. So, and it's really the also a drafter of numberless of ecumenical documents and writer, very prolific writer. So we all eager to listen to your perspectives. You will speak on epistemological and hermeneutical approaches to deal with the resolution of old problems now in new context. Thank you, Professor Henn.
Thank you very much, Teresa. So, first of all, thank you to the Anglican Center, to the Malines Conversations Group, and to the Centro Pro Unione for this honor to speak with you this morning about this topic, epistemological and hermeneutical approaches to deal with the resolution of old problems now in a new context. When I write something, I usually try to really stick to the topic that's been given to me. So that's what I did here. I really was thinking, well, what's epistemology and what's hermeneutics with regard to this project to deal with the old problems in a new context? Also, I presumed, and I think it was certainly in the first two talks, I presumed that the focus of those was going to explain the current the Sorores in Spe. Sorores in Spe, I think, makes two references, or very, very few actual references to Apostolicae Curae. Especially, it quotes the statement, absolutely null and void. So I thought, I think the third presentation by Professor O'Donnell was, of course, not just so focused on that, but on the history question. I suppose my presentation is a bit more philosophical, and it's going to focus actually on Apostolicae Curae, not on Sorores in Spe so much, but hopefully to contribute to that process. The dense and richly formulated abstract, which we read at the beginning of the text, Sorores in Spe, closes, these are the final words of the abstract at the beginning. Taking into account all of this evidence, both historical and theological, the Malines Conversations Group believes it is time for the negative judgment of Apostolicae Curae on Anglican ordinations to be revised, so that our two communions can more fully embrace one another as sisters in hope of the resurrection. End of quote. Leo XIII must have had some premonition of such a proposal for a revision, since he closes his encyclical with the following sentence: "We decree that these letters and all things contained therein shall not be liable at any time to be impugned or objected to by reason of fault or any other defect whatsoever, but are and shall be always valid and in force, and shall be inviolably observed both juridically and otherwise by all of whatsoever degree and preeminence, declaring null and void anything which in these matters may happen to be contrariwise attempted by any person whatsoever, by whatsoever authority or pretext." End of quote, paragraph 40. Well, obviously there's a direct contradiction between these statements. The Malines group wants to revise, and Leo, his intention was that his idea would never be revised. What are we supposed to do with this? The reason for Leo's forceful statement just quoted can be found in the whole process that led up to the promulgation of Apostolicae Curae in 1986. Process began some years earlier, which devotes a number of paragraphs to describing the process of re-examining the question of the validity of Anglican orders. And then here's a quote: "So that through extreme care taken in the new examination, all doubt, or even shadow of doubt, should be removed for the future." End quote. Therefore, the whole aim of the process and of the text was to arrive at a definitive judgment. Definitive. Given the topic assigned for this presentation, it is essential, therefore, for me to review briefly the content of Leo's letter, Apostolicae Curae. So what does he say? After an expression of pastoral care, he begins in a friendly way. Pastoral care, quote, for the welfare of the noble English nation, end quote, and guided by charity. The text recounts that, quote, our predecessors at the request of Queen Mary exercised their special care for the reconciliation of the English Church, end quote, and that various steps were taken during and after her reign by several popes. They sent Cardinal Pole and others to England to investigate the question of the validity of Anglican orders. The documents pertinent to those efforts were newly examined in the process that Leo had initiated, leading to his judgment in Apostolicae Curae. The conclusion of these documents are in paragraphs 7 to 21. The whole Apostolicae Curae is about 40 paragraphs, so half of the text is simply reviewing these, going back and forth between Rome and England to talk about the validity of Anglican orders. The conclusion of the examination of these documents was, and this is a quote, hence it must be clear, and this is the part that Sorores in Spain quotes, must be clear to everyone that the controversy lately revived, this is not what they quote. Lately revived has already been definitively settled by the Apostolic See. So the first half of the text is they had to go to the archives to find these letters. And the letters between the Pope and his legates said, okay, after our investigation, we definitively decide these ordinations are not valid. So that's the first half. From this point on, the encyclical changes direction and focus on the Anglican ordinal, the liturgical book, particularly in the context of considering the validity of the sacraments in terms of the categories of matter and form. Paragraphs 23 to 35. Leo states that the revision undertaken during the reign of Edward VI in the 16th century, intentionally eliminated any clear reference to the priesthood, sacerdotium, with its, quote, with its grace and power, which is chiefly that of consecrating and offering the true body and blood of the Lord. That's an internal quote to the Council of Trent. And it's, again, another internal quote, in that sacrifice which is, quote, no bare commemoration of the sacrifice offered on the cross. So the sacrificial is very strong here. Leo concludes, and then this is the part that Sorores quotes, that the true sacerdotium of Christ is utterly eliminated from the Anglican rite. With this defective form is joined the defective intention, which is equally essential to the sacrament. Defective intention means the intention to do what the Church intends to do in a particular rite. All of which leads to his statement, we pronounce that the ordinations have been and are absolutely null and utterly void, paragraph 36. The final paragraphs try to be friendly again and say, Leo's intention has been to appeal to those who, quote, seek with a sincere heart the possession of a hierarchy and of holy orders, to affirm that Christ, quote, has made the Church the dispenser, as it were, the constant guardian and promoter of his redemption among the nations, end quote, and to invite, quote, those who are ministers of religion in their respective communities who have at heart the glory of God and the salvation of souls, end quote, to courageously be led back to the bosom of their mother, the Church, led back their mother, the Church. So he invites Anglican ordained persons to be led back. That's what he's saying. So that's what you find in this text. It basically has two arguments. The one is reviewing the letters between the Pope and his legates. The other one has to do with the question of the change in the Anglican book of ordination. Those are the two issues. Now, what can we say in an epistemological and hermeneutical approach to this? That's what I'm going to talk about right now for the rest of this talk. So how is one to revisit Apostolicae Curae in such a way as to facilitate the resolution of old problems? That's the title, Resolution of Old Problems Now in a New Context. And we've heard a great deal about the new context, especially from our first two readers, but also from the third lecture too. While related, the approaches of epistemology and of hermeneutics are not exactly the same. Obviously, they can be related, but epistemology concerns how human beings know, how they come to know. Hermeneutics concerns interpretation, how we interpret texts, symbols, and practices. They both originally have philosophical roots, as you know. But beyond their philosophical employment, both can have a theological application insofar as they can be related to faith. Because of the somewhat distinctive natures of theological epistemology on the one hand, and theological hermeneutics on the other hand, I will treat them separately. So first, theological epistemology concerns the knowledge of revealed truth, how we come to know revealed truth as true. One of the most familiar classical expressions of this is perhaps the Confessions of St. Augustine, with which you all are familiar. His path to baptism was recounted in the Confessions, required him to come to see that faith is not credulity. Faith can be distinguished from mere opinion because one has discovered sound reasons for adopting the word of a trustworthy authority, which leads to further insight concerning the guidance of the divine teacher speaking to one's heart and mind internally. Augustine wrote of the eyes of faith. Are the eyes of faith being used in Apostolicae Curae? That's a question. He wrote of the eyes of faith. He interpreted the text of Isaiah 7:9, unless you believe, you will not understand, as meaning that faith precedes knowledge. So you have to have faith to have knowledge. Knowledge of a real truth. But knowledge of faith is always remains less than the promised knowledge of that vision which the believer hopes one day to receive, which we heard in our last lecture right before the break. Aquinas captured this idea of the provisional nature of faith when he affirmed that the church in via is the congregatio fidelium, while the church at the end, what we are aimed, the ultimate goal is to become the congregatio comprehendentium, face to face, to see. And these famous slogans you're familiar with, I'm sure, actus credentis terminator non ad annunciabile sed ad rem, means that, we don't have faith in a sentence, we have faith in the mystery. That's been mentioned several times today. The rem is the mystery of God, the first truth for Aquinas. Or the other one, articulus fide est perceptio divinae veritatis tendens in ipsam. It is a real grasp of divine truth, but of course there's the participle tendens. Article never is the end. It's moving. So, what can we say? I want to say that, of course, these examples from either Augustine or Aquinas of theological epistemology ultimately have firm biblical roots. St. Paul writes of our knowledge being now imperfect, then we'll know even as we are known, 1 Corinthians 13. The letter to the Ephesians, which is, as far as I can tell, the only New Testament text that actually speaks explicitly of unity in faith. In chapter 4, it says that we have to go on an ongoing process of maturing in unity in faith. That's why Christ furnished the church with these ministries, to mature in unity, in communion in faith. And the Gospel of John, of course, underlines the fact that the Spirit of truth leads us into the truth completely. John 14 and 16. None of these texts intends to promote a kind of skepticism about the ability of the believer to have a certain and true grasp of revealed truth. After all, Jesus himself is the way, the truth, and the life. And he is full of grace and truth, John 1:14. The rejection of skepticism in relation to Christian faith seems to have been the principal motive behind John Paul II's Fides et Ratio. And in that text, interestingly enough, nevertheless, he closes it with a text from my confrere, St. Bonaventure, Itinerarium Deus et Mentis, also confrere of Jim, where Bonaventure says, if you really want to know about the passage from wisdom to wisdom, which is guided by the Holy Spirit, and I quote, seek the answer in God's grace, not in doctrine, in the longing of the will, not in the understanding, in the size of prayer, not in research. Seek the bridegroom, not the teacher, God, not man, darkness and not light. And look not to the light, but rather to the raging fire that carries the soul to God with intense fervor and glowing love. That's in Fides et Ratio, quoting Bonaventure. If these can be said to be important dimensions of theological epistemology, what I've just mentioned from Augustine, Aquinas, and now Bonaventure and John Paul, then it is rather obvious that they are absent from Apostolicae Curae. As far as I can tell, Sorores in Spe makes only one reference to epistemology, and I quote, this is from paragraph 12, "It makes a difference whether one looks at reality only from the standpoint of a reductive epistemology, i.e. through the perspective of what can be stated with absolute certainty as opposed to what is only probable or possible, or whether one approaches reality through a soteriological lens." From an epistemological point of view, simply epistemological, Leo XIII's encyclical seeks to establish 2 points. I would say these are really the only 2 points about the encyclical. First, that the documentation from the activity of the popes and the papal legates after Queen Mary requested this investigation concerning the validity of Anglican orders, that the documentation from the 16th and 17th centuries, he only mentions in Leo these two, the documentation from those which they got out of the archives. They're not printed in Denzing or anything like that, these letters. That he wants to investigate them and see if they have a negative judgment. And he does investigate them, and they do have a negative judgment. I mean, who can deny it? You can see the letters. And the second thing, that the wording of the Anglican ordination rites was changed and eliminated some references to the priesthood and sacrifice. And again, I think you just look at the books, and again, you can establish that there was a change. And so these two are the things that he wanted his commission just wanted to look at, and they found the answer to both of those. Now, these are historical facts. They're not anything to do with revelation. They're about the letters between the Pope and the delegates, and they're about a change in the book. Evidently, the first of these letters between the Pope and legates, which they had to even find in the archive, obviously these are not a good basis for a definitive decision about a question so as important as the validity of ordination. Yet the Pope seems to have thought that would be sufficient, that it was already determined. But I don't think private letters, can do that. The other thing about the ordinal could possibly be significant if, in fact, the whole question of eliminating sacrifice and priesthood from the rite is really a powerful, a significant theological argument. So what I want to do is take up that second question in my second part. So the first part was about theological epistemology, and I think we found that in terms of theological epistemology, we don't really have it so much in a knowledge of revelation. What we have are historical judgments, which probably could be taken for as accurate. But then the question is, what is the consequence of this? How about theological hermeneutics? So Sorores in Spe has an entire section entitled The Hermeneutics of Tradition and Salvation, with 6 sections, although the paragraphs outlining the development of the relations between Anglicans and Catholics, which also appear in the first section, are significant also hermeneutically. And we heard about these, especially this section on hermeneutics in the second talk this morning, very nicely presented in terms of liturgy and new insights of Vatican II, while the first talk gave us a nice outline of the text too. But in any case, the first chapter, which talks about the experience in the since Apostolicae Curae, puts us in our relationship in a thoroughly new light. And these 6 paragraphs, we already heard about what each one talks about, and so I'm not going to focus on them so much as to look at the hermeneutical questions with regard to Apostolicae Curae. First of all, maybe a little point about what is ecumenical hermeneutics. It would be appropriate to give a brief description of theological hermeneutics in general, and of what might be called ecumenical hermeneutics in particular. Werner Genrond opened his very well-known study about theological hermeneutics with these words: "By hermeneutics we mean the theory of interpretation, The word contains a reference to Hermes, the messenger of the gods in Greek mythology. Hermes' task was to explain to humans the decisions and the plans of the gods. And thus, he bridged the gap between the divine and the human realm. Similarly, hermeneutics is concerned, theological hermeneutics, with the examination of a relationship between two realms, the realms of a text or work of art on the one hand, and the people who wish to understand it on the other. Thus, one needs to try to understand the framework and the intention embedded in Leo's encyclical. And I have chosen to apply Genron's proposal about interpretation to two of the central themes of Apostolicae Curae. I don't want to. The two themes I want to apply hermeneutics to are these: church and sacrament. What is Leo's idea of church in Apostolicae Curae? What is the idea of sacrament in Apostolicae Curae? Church. Leo sees the church as the mother, whom Christ has established as dispenser of salvation by means of those of whose sacraments faithful souls have their sins truly forgiven and are restored to friendship with Christ. Paragraph 37. There is an exclusive identification between the Church of Christ and the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic, I suppose you could say, in the sense that by restoring the true sacrament of order as instituted by Christ, the way will be smooth for the return of the Anglicans to holy unity. Gregory Baum, writing about the ecclesiological vision of the Catholic Church prior to Vatican II, comments, and this is a quote from Baum: "The people of God is one. It is one in the sense that there is and can only be a single church, and one in the sense that the faithful constitute a united human family of which God is the Father." End of quote. That this vision is that of Leo XIII is confirmed by another of his encyclicals of the same year, 1896, Satis Cognitum, which stresses that the unity of the church requires unity of faith, and that's why Jesus chose the apostles and founded upon which he would found the church, so that there would be a living teaching office capable of maintaining apostolic faith throughout history. Allora, the accurate hermeneutical interpretation of Apostolicae Curae with regard to what it means by church, I think, is this. It's in a very exclusive identification. It's the place where one can be saved, and it's a call for anybody who's a Christian who's not part of the Catholic Church to return. Even the words return is used. As John Paul II wrote in Ut Unum Sint, it is not that beyond the boundaries of the Catholic community there is an ecclesial vacuum. Many elements of great value, which in the Catholic Church are part of the fullness of the means of salvation, gifts which God gave to the Church, are found in the other Christian communities. Ut Unum Sint 13. Another quote: "Thanks to ecumenism, our contemplation of the mighty works of God has been enriched by new horizons, for which the triune God calls us to give thanks. The knowledge that the Spirit is at work in other Christian communities, the discovery of examples of holiness, the experience of the immense riches present in the communion of saints, and contact with unexpected dimensions of Christian commitment." End of quote. Ut Unum Sint 15. It's very clear, no, that this vision of church, of the ecclesial reality in churches which are not in union with the Church of Rome, is present. So there's something about the vision of church in Apostolicae Curae which doesn't work. Sacrament. As mentioned above at the close of my section on the epistemology, the most crucial theological part, in my view, of Leo's argument is found in the second half of the encyclical, which recounts the examination of the Anglican ordinal by the group of experts which the Pope assembled, and they assessed that there has been an essential defect in the form of the rite of ordination. Because of the defective form, the experts advised the Pope to conclude that there's also a defect in intention. to do what the Church intends to do. How do you know the intention? The Pope explicitly says you only know the intention by looking at the form. If the form doesn't include words that seem to suggest the intention, then there's not the intention. That's what he said. And what does that mean? That means that evidently the defective intention is totally dependent upon his affirmation about the defective form. If there isn't a defective form, then you can't talk about a defective intention, according to the Pope's own way of lining it up. Right. So Leo's quotation, he quotes about matter and form then. He says that there's a defect of the form. And he bases that, he does quote this, he uses quotes from earlier official Catholic teachings, which are really have to be respected by Catholics anyhow. The Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is one of his sources in Apostolicae Curae 25. And it's probably his principal source for the view of the sacraments. As you know, the Council of Trent talked about the sacraments, responding to visions of sacraments proposed mainly by Protestant reformers. And mainly the Council of Trent wanted to say that the sacraments are effective and necessary in themselves, ex opere operato, we could say, and that faith alone, fide sola fide, is not enough. That's Denzinger, 1608, from the Council of Trent. Trent speaks about the matter-form framework in discussing the sacraments, but he's really following earlier councils, the Council of Florence, Exsultate Domine, which was on unity with the Eastern churches. And it talks explicitly about essential to a sacrament is the form and the matter. And it was used also in the condemnations of Wycliffe and Huss. So an adequate interpretation, as it urged by Genron, my guide here in the Theological and Hermeneutics, would seem to result in saying that this is the meaning of sacraments in Apostolicae Curae. The sacrament is matter and form. That's when you can know that a sacrament has taken place. There seems to be some consensus among historians of sacramental theology concerning the origins of this matter-form conception. Various positions concerning the number of sacraments had arisen at the turn of the millennium. Some theologians said there were 4 sacraments. Some said 5. Some said 10. Some said 12. My field is not sacraments, but you can see this talk by Jim that forced me to go into the dictionaries and books. But anyhow, there were these different enumerations, and this was a problem. How many sacraments are there? Well, Peter Lombard came up with a solution in the 12th century, in the 1100s. He said that you could clarify which rites are actually truly sacraments if you use the matter-form hylomorphic framework, which was employed philosophically to describe the causes of any particular reality. So what are the causes of a sacrament? Well, they have to have material and formal causes. These explain the efficacy of a sacrament bestowing grace, a framework which soon led to the determination that there are 7 and only 7 in Western theology, 7 and only 7 which can truly be called sacraments. And this was related to the matter-form idea. Lombard's sentences became an influential point of reference for later theology, and through theology also had an important influence on subsequent official teaching about the sacraments, like the Council of Florence and other times. Trent. Sacramental theologians have pointed out at least 2 significant problems with the matter-form view. First of all, the history of the celebration and the theological understanding of the sacraments existed within the Christian community for over 1,000 years prior to the use of this matter-form framework to explain the sacraments. Did they not know what the sacraments were? They didn't use this expression at all. And it's the key expression to Apostolicae Curae, as far as I can tell. Some have noted that patristic writers, the names of Tertullian and Augustine, figure prominently among sacramental theologians, have their roots in both the Old and New Testament, quindi not matter-form there, but also in the patristic writings. Second, this matter-form framework, a second problem, is that it tends to cosify sacraments. It's a thing. which is related simply to the individual. The individual receives a sacrament if matter and form is there. Boom. So the community is eliminated. The worship of the community of believers as a whole is absent from this view, matter, form. One example, you may be surprised, of the insufficiency of this approach, matter-form approach, can be found in an article by Joseph Ratzinger on the theology of baptism. He notes, he has an article on the theology of baptism, and he says that the celebration of baptism found in the early centuries with its catechumenate, culminating in a rite which involved a dialogue of three parties: the community, the person to be baptized, and Almighty God. That this is a vision of a basis for a theology of sacrament which is incredibly richer than matter form. If you just think of sacrifice, pouring some water and saying, I baptize you, Ratzinger says that the theology of baptism that comes out of the celebration of baptism in the early church shows that it is a moment of profound communion of the baptized, of the community, and God. And that, to just think of sacraments in terms of matter form, especially if it means water and a formula, it misses much. Experts in sacramental theology have demonstrated that many held the conviction in the early 20th century, at least, maybe earlier, that there was a profound need for new renewal in sacramental theology to get beyond matter form. The rediscovery of the significance of the actio liturgica. We've heard about that somewhat this morning. The rediscovery of the Paschal mystery, of the sacramental nature of the church as a whole, of pneumatology, to list just a few themes, are called for a rethinking of sacramental theology. An article by Karl Rahner notes that the theology of sacraments needs to be seen in relation to and integrated with the history of salvation, as seen in the Old and New Testaments, with ecclesiology, with Christology and soteriology and the theology of grace, and with eschatology. Interesting enough, in his article in Sacramentum Mundi, well-known book on, or series on, manual on theology, not even once in his article on the theology of sacraments do the words matter and form appear in this text by Karl Rahner on the theology of sacraments. Vatican II Unitatis Redentio, paragraph 3, points out that the Holy Spirit makes use of Christian communities not in full communion with the Catholic Church as a means of salvation. Such language recognizes means of salvation. Such language recognizes a sacramentality pertaining to those other churches. If that's so, could it make any sense to say that the saints and martyrs of these churches were saints and martyrs in spite of the service of their ordained ministers? Could that possibly make any sense? That the ordained ministry had no effect on these saints? Well, final point, resolving old problems. That was the issue here, resolving old problems now in a new context. Faith and Order study entitled A Treasure in Earthen Vessels. Dr. Grazzelizzo was part of all of that production of that work, I believe. Offers a helpful description of the precise activity of ecumenical hermeneutics. I've been asked to speak about hermeneutics. It says this: ecumenical dialogue about ecumenical hermeneutics, which prompts the parties involved to question each other, to understand each other, to explain their positions to each other, makes surprising discoveries possible. Intolerant polemics and controversies have made incompatible assertions out of what was really the result of two different ways of looking at the same reality. Nowadays, this is John Paul II, Ut Udum Sint 38. Nowadays, we need to find the formula which, by capturing the reality in its entirety, will enable us to move beyond partial readings and eliminate false interpretations. End of quote. It seems to me that the call by the Malines Conversations group to revisit the condemnation of Anglican orders and Apostolicae Curae can be seen as a way of putting into practice precisely what John Paul is calling for in this text. My hope is their efforts will bear much fruit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Henn, for your philosophical, theological wisdom. You have just confirmed to be always an ecumenical resource. Thank you so much. And now, we had 4 very interesting speeches this morning, which I know is not easy to reflect on in a short time, because they were really so rich that probably we need time also to absorb. But still, we have about 10 minutes, I would say, for a discussion. And so again, I invite those who are online following and those here in presence to just exchange your ideas on all these thoughts that have been raised up this morning. Please.
Thanks very much. It's Jeremy Morris from Cambridge. I suppose this is a question that certainly we in the Malene group have been thinking about, but which has come out very, very strongly to me this morning, and that is really the question about how does a church which has relied so strongly on a cumulative tradition of authoritative document issuing go in reverse? How does what would it take for the Catholic Church, and what would be the implication for it to say, actually, this papal bull was wrong? Is the anxiety, at least on the part of some in the Catholic Church, that in order to do that, you would have to have some secure basis on which you could make that judgment in turn? And so the fear is that there would be, it's a sort of slippery slope argument. If you say, actually, we made a mistake here, where then do you apply, where do you find the limit? What is the standard by which you assess those claims of the past? That's the sort of question and I wondered if, Father William, you had anything to say on that.
Yes, I do. First of all, I think that if the Malene's Conversations group wants to just say Apostolicae Curae is wrong, is a mistake, I think that's a dead end. I think that'll never work. I think what you have to do is say what, for example, A Treasure in Earthen Vessels says. It says that one must interpret things. I would say the first step would be interpret, like I've tried to do, the text in terms of questions of vision of sacrament and vision of church. But I would say not just that. I would say at the same time the group needs to present and interpret the response of the 2 Anglican archbishops side by side. Let's see what those say. Then I would say it certainly is good to revise and reject certain things, but I think one has to accept what's good. Is there anything good about Apostolicae Curae? That'll be a good challenge for the group. But I think he wants to say that the churches all should have a certain common faith about sacraments and about ordination. And I believe Anglicans believe that too. I think he wants to say there's a profound relation between ordination and Eucharist. And I think Anglicans want to say that too. I'd say there's a number of different issues there that one could hold up as wanting to continue, but also pointing out that certain presuppositions, for example, the presupposition, it seems to me with this whole defect of form thing, is that somehow the words sacrifice and priesthood, if they aren't present in the rite, that the rite is no good. Now that is a presupposition. He does not prove that. So I would say that would be something to look at. What are the elements that are necessary? But also, for example, I believe that Anglicans and Catholics could agree totally with Leo that there is a way to ordain somebody, and that we have to follow that way. There are ways of totally escaping that, or just throwing it away. And Anglicans don't believe that, and neither do Catholics. So I'd say it would be valuable, not if we just come across wanted to reject. That's not going to work. I think what we need to do is find points of contact and points of correction and points of interpretation, and all that together, I think, could promise to come up with a better solution.
I'd like to just add one thing, Bill. That I think that's very good advice. But there are a whole series of papal documents, for example, the suppression of the Jesuits, that has the same phrase at the end, that this is irreformable. Jesuits are around today, aren't they? So, so what happens is that, we have a different vision. Our sight changes, and without saying this was utterly wrong, we can say that we've learned from this experience and we move on from that. And I think Bill's suggestion about how we do that, I think, is really fundamental here, because we have a whole different way of looking at the understanding of theology. For example, the sacramental shift is a change to a philosophical underpinning from one system to another. Well, we have another system today. So, we are moving on, and I think truth remains absolute. It's we who are learning how to appreciate that truth, and the fact is that we need to have each other to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Bill, for your hugely inspiring paper. Another example of that would be the Church's teaching on the Jews, the Vatican II, post-Vatican II teaching on the Church's relationship with the Jewish people. I also wonder whether another part of Leo XIII's vision that might ironically be helpful for us is what he clearly has to say about the singularity of the Church. Now, obviously for him, this is about, people coming back to the one true Church. Well, fast forward 100 and a bit years, I think we still want to say that there is only one Church. There is one ministry. There is one episcopate. There is one Eucharist worldwide. But perhaps that singularity of the Church is our friend in this context, in a rather difficult and slightly ironic way.
So it seems the Malines Conversation Group has already a task for the future. Are you ready to draft a second document right away? Thanks to all the speakers, really a heartfelt thanks to all of you. Speakers, thanks to all of you who have followed us, and I think we have been fratres and sorores in spe unitatis this morning, don't we? Thank you very much.